This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. You know what's one of the most interesting parallels that I've thought of with the whole Myles trade is an ironic parallel, given who the Browns have had in their management, who has been leading the strategic planning of the team for a long period of time here in Cleveland, and who just left, which is Paul DePodesta. Paul DePodesta, for those of you who don't know, was famous for a concept called Moneyball that he established with Brandon Beaton. Now, what this concept was the idea that you can make up star players in the aggregate, which is to say, if you get enough really good players, it can make up for not having the great player, right? And this obviously was a controversial idea. It's still controversial to this day, whether it applies evenly in baseball, basketball, football, right? Different sports are different sports. Star power means more in different sports, right? Like, it'd be hard to moneyball your way to a NBA title, but you can make the argument that some teams have moneyballed their way into a World Series championship, but you can also do it the other way, right? The Dodgers did the anti-moneyball, all-stars, right? You know, and they won the last World Series. So that is interesting that the Browns have that DNA in them, because this Myles Garrett trade feels like a Moneyball move, right? It feels like a bet that we can make up Myles Garrett in the aggregate, right? For the football argument for Moneyball, Myles Garrett kind of serves as the Jason Giambi, who I think was the big piece that they moved out. I forget. I'm not a big baseball fan, so I don't know specifically what was the catalyst in there. Somebody in the comments certainly knows that. But Myles Garrett moved out. Can you replace what you're losing with him in the aggregate? That's what I want to discuss today. What it's going to take from the players on this defense to be able to replace Myles in the aggregate. To be able to understand that, first we have to understand what the Browns have lost this offseason. All right, so I'm going to put the graphic up later, and it's going to be about sack production, but there's a lot of production that's going to be lost, right? Myles Garrett himself made up for 43% of the Cleveland Browns sack production in 2025. He also made up for 34% of the team's pressures. Now, before we get into any conversation about edge rusher stats, this disclaimer has to go. Edge rusher stats, or just defensive line stats, and honestly, defense stats in general, have this issue in football, right? If I look at pressures for Jared Verse on Pro Football Focus, or pressures for Jared Verse on Pro Football Reference, or pressures for Jared Verse on Next Gen Stats, I'm going to get three different numbers, sometimes more, right? If you just look at raw pressures on Pro Football Focus, it says Jared Verse has like 100 pressures. If you look at Pro Football Reference, it says 36. Next Gen Stats, he says 67, right? A lot of these statistics are not measured by an objective rubric, which means everybody's number is going to be different. So it's more important you understand what that metric is tracking specifically to understand the number that it's spitting out, right? Because PFF might have 100 pressures, but the way that they measure their pressures, it might be garbage, right? It might not really be an active measurement or an accurate measurement of that player's impact. Pro Football Reference might measure it in such a harsh way that 36 is just not really enough to really view it. So you kind of got to look at these stats based on where these guys rank in the league, the percentage of what they're tracking, and kind of just like work with it from there. So if you go out and you try to replicate this, keep this in mind. You're going to get different pressure stats from different websites. You're going to get different missed tackle numbers, right? Like Jared Verse has 23 missed tackles on Pro Football Focus. He has 3 on Pro Football Reference. And I know he had more than 3 missed tackles this season. But how teams determine missed tackles. Drops is another one, right? You'll get different stats about drops from different websites because there's not one agreed upon way that we're going about measuring this, right? Some people measure drops on vibes. Some people measure drops very strictly. It's not as universal and as concrete as we would like it to be. So keep that in mind. So when it comes to pressures and stuff like that, anytime I'm talking about pressures, I really care about the TPS, the true pass sets, pressure charting that Pro Football Focus does. I find that to be pretty accurate. And I'm going to focus on the next gen stats ranking of pressure because I can verify that on NFL Plus, right? Like I can just watch the playlist that they have connected to that statistic and literally count it myself. So I find that number to be more reliable. So that's what I'm going. And the reason that I'm going to focus in on those 2 numbers specifically when trying to measure stuff. But yeah, when you look at it, Myles responsible for a huge number of pressures, and obviously he was a huge amount of the Browns' sack production last year. You know, if you replace Myles' sack production with Jared Verse's sack production, the Browns go from the 3rd best team in terms of total sacks to the 16th best team in terms of total sacks, right? If you look at pressures, they go from 12 to 16, right? So if Jared Verse comes here, replaces Myles, does the same thing he did last year, the Browns will be a better than average defense on a lot of these statistics, but they won't be where they were before. So what we want to other notable stats here that the Browns are going to have to make up. The TFL difference between the 2 players is significant, right? They're going to have to make that up in the aggregate. So 11 TFLs for Jared Verse, 29 for Myles Garrett. Obviously, a lot of those are sacks. Win rate, you're going to have to make up a huge gap there. Jared Verse's win rate in true pass sets was 20.8. Myles Garrett, 32.7, so a 12.1% win rate difference. So you're going to need a lot of guys to up their percentages, including Jared Verse himself. There's a lot that Myles brought to the table. So let's focus on the sack production. There's a lot that Myles brought to the table, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Browns will make that up in the aggregate. Here's my guess on how they can make up at least the sack production in the aggregate. But first, I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a fun way to earn cash while you watch your favorite teams. No complex betting rules. Just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. Here are my picks for this upcoming season, AFC North edition. Jimmy Bernard, I have less than 475. This has to do with volume available in Pittsburgh's offense. Quincy Judkins, I have over 975. Browns improved line. I think the run game is going to be better with it. Chase Brown, under 900 yards. Joe Burrow equals less rushing yards usually for the Bengals offense. Mark Andrews, more than 475 yards. Lamar's going to need a safety blanket. Check to see if PrizePicks is available in your state. You could follow me on the app at Quinn_C to see all my lineups. Download the PrizePicks app today. Play $5 and get $50 in lineup to download the app using the link in the description. So if the Browns want to make up the number of sacks that they're going to miss from not having Myles on this team, right? It is a pretty simple. Okay, so Myles Garrett wasn't the only player that was leaving the Cleveland Browns this year, right? The Browns lost other players who are also responsible for sacks. So let's look at the total amount of sacks out for this football team that they're dealing with. Myles Garrett, 23 sacks on the way out. Cam Thomas, he's in Atlanta, 2.5 on the way out. Devin Bush is in Chicago on the way out. Jerome Baker is not on a team right now, 1.5 sacks. And then Shelby Harris is in New York, 1 sack. So it's about a total of 30 sacks that the Browns have lost. They had 53 team sacks last year, minus 30. That gets them to 23. And then if you add Jared Verse's sack total to that, since we're taking Myles out, we swap those 2 players, you sit at about 30.5 sacks, so about the estimated amount for the Browns this year. And if you subtract 30.5 sacks from the 53 that the Browns had last year, you have a shortfall of about 22.5 sacks. So how do you make up for those 22.5 sacks if you're the Cleveland Browns? How are they going to be able to do this? Well, let's look at it. This is going to be one of the more interesting challenges. So in order for the Browns to make up for Myles in the aggregate, they're going to have a lot of guys up their sack production. Now, there is an argument that a lot of guys can up their sack production because Myles is not there to monopolize the opportunity. And the good news is that I don't think it takes something insane in order for you to get there, right? Every number I'm showing you here, I think is pretty reasonable. And I'll go through each player and explain why I think it's reasonable that they can get to these sack totals, right? So I'm not saying in order to make up for Myles Garrett, you have to have Jared Verse get 18 sacks. I'm not saying in order for this, you have to have multiple people get to 15 or something crazy like that. That's not what I'm trying to come here and say. What I'm saying is that making this up in the aggregate, it's going to take a lot of bodies in that rotation, but it's possible. It's not something I look at and think is ridiculous on the face of it. So let's go through it, right? So Jared Verse had 7.5 sacks last year. I think in order to make up for Myles in the aggregate, you want him as your number one edge rusher, as the centerpiece of the defense, the centerpiece of that trade. I think it's acceptable and very fair to expect Jared Verse to get you 12 sacks. I don't think that's putting too much on him. I don't think that's putting too little on him. I think 12 sacks is a very fair number. If you don't think that number is fair, please explain it to me in the comment section down below why you think 12 is too much, right? If you think 12 is too little, we'll see, right? But if you think 12 is too much, I don't get that argument, right? The player that Jared Verse is, we're talking about a top 10 edge. You expect 12 sacks out of a guy like that, right? Like, I think that's a fair number, right? Mason Graham, he probably suffered the most from Myles Garrett's run. I think he could have had somewhere north of 7 sacks last year. I think 6.5 is a fair number for him to get now that Myles isn't there to cannibalize his sack opportunities, right? A lot of his pressures were just eaten up by Myles Garrett. I think he'll actually be in the opposite opportunity or get the opposite opportunity this year, right? Jared Verse, a lot of speed to power, a lot of bull rush, which means a lot of times where a quarterback's going to step up in the middle to avoid him. And that's going to put Mason Graham in a position to kind of eat off of the pressures that Jared Verse is creating. So I think him making that jump plus 6 sacks from 0.5 last year is very possible. I actually think it's a low estimate. I think he can get somewhere to like 9 sacks in a season. So wouldn't be surprised if that happens for him. But 6.5, I feel like is, again, a real realistic, fair number. Mike Hall, for similar reasons, right, to Jared Verse, I think he's probably going to jump from 1.5 to 5 sacks here, plus 3.5. The reason I think that is possible is, one, Mike Hall, really quick first step. Again, if Jared Verse is getting guys to step up in the pocket because he's getting that bull rush pressure on the outside, then there's going to be a lot of opportunity for those interior defensive tackles. And Mike Hall, for the first time in his career, is getting a full offseason, hopefully, if he stays healthy. So if he's able to stay healthy, he's able to stay on the field, get back to what he was his rookie year and improve off of that, where he was at like a 17% win rate. I think that production, plus 3.5 sack jump for his production, very, very reasonable to make up that shortfall. Alex Wright, gonna have to jump from about 5.5 sacks to about 7. I think that's a fair number. I think Alex Wright is more than capable of getting 7 sacks. I don't think anybody would be shocked if he got 7 sacks here. That's plus 1.5. Isaiah McGuire, you know what I mean? Going from 2 sacks to 5 sacks. I don't think anybody thinks that's crazy. I think he's somebody who, again, sacrificed because Myles was on the roster and Myles did cannibalize a lot of the sacks that were available there, right? Now, let's be honest here. Myles did create a lot of opportunities for sacks as well. So there is that. So we can't just have it one way with that conversation. Myles is a Hall of Fame level player. You're going to feel his impact, or more accurately, feel the lack of his impact being there, right? Like, it's just undeniable that that's going to happen. But again, we're just talking about making up the numbers in the aggregate, not necessarily replacing the total impact of Myles, which is a little bit greater than the numbers. Aiden Huntington, right? Half a sack last year. I think he can get to 3 sacks, go up about 2.5. I think that'd be a nice little jump for him. I do think you got to account for a little bit of a regression here from Malik Collins. I have him dropping about 4.5 sacks from 6.5. I think Malik Collins is the guy whose sack total benefited the most from Myles Garrett being there, right? Like, no Myles probably means a 2-sack loss for him. Quentin Williams being on the team. If Quentin Williams is on this team, I feel really good about this defensive line. But Quincy Williams, 2 sacks. I think that's about an average for him. I think Devin Bush got 2 sacks, so if he gets 2, that's pretty good. And then Emmanuel McNeil-Warren getting 2 sacks as well. And that's a way to get to, I think if you add all of that up, you get about 23 sacks, which is making up for Myles Garrett in the aggregate. That's what it looks like. Now, if you want to have the debate about impact versus the numbers, there is something to be said there about having Myles Garrett and the impact that that's going to have inherently because he is Myles Garrett. That's not what we're talking about today. We're just talking about trying to replicate the numbers that this team had last year in the aggregate, right, with all of these players. And if you're asking me, is it possible for the Browns to be top 5 in sack production, even without Myles Garrett? I think that is possible. I think my worry about not having Myles on this defense is more about the secondary and the amount of opportunities that they're going to have to be exposed more often because Myles isn't there to scare teams away from throwing the football, right? That is something I do worry about, right? How Tyson Campbell's going to hold up. You know, is Emmanuel McNeil-Warren going to be good early? That's going to make a huge difference in how much teams can test you through the air, right? Like, it's just going to be a lot more difficult. Carson Schlesinger holding up in coverage. I think he's going to be fine, but I don't know how Quincy Williams is going to fare in coverage, right? Or other linebackers where we're, quite frankly, pretty thin at that position. So that's the area where I worry more about. The defensive line. That's actually, like, they're in a position to replace those numbers fairly well, right? Mason Graham was a top 5 pick. Jarrett Verse is somebody they see as a multiple first-round pick value. So you got 2 centerpieces on that defensive line. Like, if it weren't for the fact that we had traded Myles, if the Browns just had Jarrett Verse and had Mason Graham just by drafting those players over the last 3 years, we'd be thrilled with that combination if we never had Myles on the roster to begin with, right? So it's a really good combination there on the defensive line. That's not the part of this team that's going to hurt the most. So the sack production, I think, is really possible to make up. And I do think that that will replicate some of the impact that you're going to be losing with Myles Garrett. And that's why I don't think this defense is going to fall completely off because they don't have Myles Garrett. I've seen some people say that the Browns defense is going to go like outside the top 15. I think that's a little bit far-fetched. Still a really strong defensive line, still some really good starters in some really key places. They still have Denzel Ward. Like, I was talking about this on AFC North Talk, and somebody made the point that it might be like the Browns defense without Myles could be like the Raiders. But my argument was, like, the Browns still, like, if you compare the Browns defensive roster to like Cincinnati, there's 3 players I'm definitely taking before anybody on that Cincinnati roster from the Cleveland Browns. Like, I would take Jarrett Verse, no question about it, over everybody on that Bengals roster, defensive roster at least. I would definitely take Carson Schlesinger over everybody on that Bengals roster. And I would take Denzel Ward over everybody on that Bengals roster, right? Like, if we did a draft and you're comparing the Browns to like the Bengals or something like that, like, this is still a much better defense than a team like that. But they're going to be more susceptible to more things, right? So I don't think they're going to be back to top 3 elite level. I think that's going to take some time for them to have, you know, Carson really blossom into being a superstar level player. Emmanuel McNeil-Warren blossom into being a star player. Like, it's going to take some young guys really hitting their prime to get back into that top 5 form. But if we're talking about a defense that could be in the top 8, they're certainly capable of doing that. And replacing that sack production in the aggregate is certainly a way to get there. And it's not a very difficult leap for this team to do, because, we could criticize Andrew for that trade, but he has stocked this team up with enough young defensive line talent to where I can look at this and not think it's ridiculous and think that we can actually maybe even improve our sack number from last year. Obviously, nobody's going to break the sack record on this team, but I think we can have a similar amount of pressure, if not more, have a similar amount of sacks, and the defensive line not be a problem for this team and still be a strength for this team. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.